Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Psychological Advertising by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from Horizon, the Magazine of Useful and Intelligent Living, Volume 18, Number 1, Summer 1958. Psychological Advertising by Manly P. Hall. It is becoming more obvious every day that the pioneer investigators and researchers in psychological theory and practice opened a Pandora's box. From all that can be learned, the original intention was to improve man's understanding of himself and make available a new remedial science to assist in the solution of the mental and emotional ills of humankind. For some years, psychology remained reasonably true to its primary objectives. Though still largely in an experimental state, it has conferred certain benefits which are noteworthy and meritorious. Recent trends, however, seem to indicate the entrance into the field of a number of economic opportunists whose attitudes and procedures are legitimate causes of anxiety. According to recent reports, business organizations throughout the country are creating or supporting research groups not only to psychoanalyze public opinion, but to strongly condition this opinion for private advantage and profit. These programs are calculated to lower buyers' resistance or to cater to the basic weaknesses of human nature. Neither of these purposes can be regarded as ethical, although strong efforts are made to justify them. It may be true that it is valuable and important to find out what people really want, but knowledge in any field brings with it ethical responsibility. To preserve an economy, we must also have the courage to provide what is needed. We cannot continuously cater to public opinion if this is contrary to individual and collective security. For his own peace of mind, he must be encouraged to develop sufficient discrimination to know what he can afford in order that he may live within his means and with a minimum of personal anxiety. The use of psychological knowledge to overstimulate impractical attitudes will ultimately endanger the structure of our national economy. New discoveries in the field of psychology can help us to understand each other, but this does not justify us in exploiting this knowledge for selfish purposes. It would seem, therefore, that the structure of modern ethics is inadequate to cope with the pressures of the profit system. We must conclude that those responsible have not been properly indoctrinated with the nobler sentiments of the race. If this is due to lack of adequate ethical and moral instruction in our educational institutions, it is time to remedy this deficiency. We are assured by experts that public spending is entirely out of hand. It is responsible for a private debt reaching astronomical proportions. Living as we do in uncertain and in tranquil times, we have mortgaged our futures to the degree that health and happiness are undermined. It is not unusual today for a family with $400 in the bank to owe from $10,000 to $20,000. Conservatively speaking, high wages and continuous employment must be assured for the next 15 to 25 years to preserve the present level of prosperity. In this thinking, which is totally unrealistic, there is little provision for unusual emergencies. While it is true that group insurance is underwriting part of the hazard of sickness, there are other dangers ahead which cannot even be clearly estimated. Assuming that psychological insight into mortal behavior can further increase the distribution of expensive commodities, is it safe or proper to continue to press additional expenditures upon those already so heavily burdened? There are limitations upon public spending, and beyond these lie chaos and disaster. It is still possible for the provident person to make certain individual decisions. He can use his mind to curb his instincts and remain solvent. Can such a person resist a scientific undermining of his common sense? Against him are groups of experts who have available to them the information necessary to undermine his personal psychological integration, even without his own knowledge, and certainly without his own consent. Everyone has a breaking point. Resolutions are usually not so strong that they cannot be ultimately shaken. It is not very pleasant to realize that highly paid scientists are being engaged to discover our weaknesses and play upon them. It all hints of sorcery, the modern version of medieval necromancy. The newspapers have recently announced that experiments are now being made with invisible advertising to be used on television. According to these reports, commercials can be flashed on and off a television screen so rapidly that they cannot be seen by the human eye, but can be registered clearly in the subconscious mind. Such commercials can be inserted anywhere in a program, and the viewer never knows when he has been subjected to them. He suddenly discovers, however, that he has a powerful craving for a certain brand of coffee, a particular deodorant, or a special glamorous bath soap. At first, the idea seems rather ridiculous, with hundreds of companies advertising almost identical products, and our subconscious mind trying to cope with level upon level of such impacts. Gradually, the danger becomes more apparent. The accounts tell us that the commercial is on the screen from only 1/300th to 1/500th of a second at a time, and therefore we have no visual consciousness of having seen it. Like the rapid shutter of a camera, however, which can impregnate a film at 1/500th to 1,000th of a second, the advertising is registered on the subconscious mind. The experiment seems to have been based on the psychological discovery that man can see much more than he knows he can see, and furthermore that this internal recording is relatively permanent. Under hypnosis, for example, an individual can describe in the greatest detail the contents of a room which made no impression upon his conscious processes of sight. He can also restore this description in every detail after an interval of 20 or 30 years. This gives some concept of the significance of such a program. Has any person or organization the right to insinuate its advertising into our psychic lives in a manner calculated to frustrate judgment or undermine free choice of products? Advertising up to date has gone about as far along psychological lines as is possible within any framework of ethics. To take away from the consumer his final conscious decision is going much too far. We should not be hypnotized into buying, any more than we should be over-influenced in our decisions by friends, neighbors, and relatives. We may say that this is only a matter of degree, for repetitious advertising already influences the individual in his selection of merchandise. This he knows, however, and he has built certain defenses against it. He always has the right to tune out a commercial or to ignore it, or to say to himself that he has already found a satisfactory product. If, however, he watches programs at all, he may be subjected to this so-called invisible ad. Experiments have shown that he does respond often to his own amazement. He therefore finds himself with mysterious cravings and unfulfilled desires which have no foundation in his normal thinking. If he is not trained to defend his mind, he is faced with a serious predicament. Very few people can withstand internal pressure. If advertising eludes the censorship of consciousness and reflection, man's most reliable instruments of discrimination are taken from him. Nor have we any reason to hope that the mechanism of the invisible ad will be under adequate ethical directive. The moment we find that the process is technically successful, it will most certainly be exploited. What is to prevent the broadening use of this technique to influence man's religious, political, and moral conduct? Here would be an opinion-making device which could threaten the survival of our freedom of worship, our attitudes toward races and nations, our election of public servants, and countless other rights which we have struggled so long to attain. Our entire way of life could come under the control of any individual or group that could command the television audience. We would find ourselves impelled to accept that which we would normally find outrageous or unsatisfactory. Less spectacular, but actually equally insidious, is the psychoanalysis of the composite public mind for purposes of exploitation. The route is somewhat more circuitous, but the destination is identical. The moment we use superior knowledge to exploit ignorance or the relative lack of knowledge, we are again approaching the precincts of sorcery. The only proper end of knowledge is that it shall be used for the common good. No other use is justifiable. Industrial psychology can certainly learn the foibles of mankind. It can discover our innate selfishness, our natural vanity, and our desperate desire to excel others, if only in terms of expenditures. But such discoveries are worse than meaningless if they are not put to a constructive use. Probably the difficulty lies in the surfeit of products, most of which are of approximately the same merit or demerit. The manufacturer can no longer find new and valid ways of publicizing his goods. 20 brands of coffee cannot all be the best, and the public is not sufficiently discriminating to recognize the subtle differences in preparation and blending. The same is true of most other advertised products. There are also certain rules and regulations which prohibit the discrediting of competitive merchandise. The merit system has gone out of fashion, and it is the advertising and not the product that must be sold. This means a careful analysis of the sales procedure in terms of collective and individual appeal. Up to a certain point, sales programs succeed because of their originality and ingenuity. Even this, however, has limitations. Advertising agencies of almost equal ability are available to all manufacturers. There comes a time when every conceivable device has been overworked. This has led to programs of psychological research, the desperate searching after unexplored recesses of the human libido. A few years of high-priced investigation will also exhaust this field, for there are only certain impulses within man that can be exploited, and as each of these is discovered, it will be deluged by advertising. Obviously, the perfect customer is the individual who will buy anything and everything, whether he needs it or not. Such reasoning is childish, however, because no one can go in debt beyond a certain degree and still retain any purchasing power. In sober fact, production is exceeding reasonable demand. The market is not large enough to consume the goods now offered, yet new offerings appear every day. The manufacturer is thinking in terms of perpetual expansion. Each year, his sales must break previous records. He must build new factories, discover new outlets, and distribute his products throughout a shrinking world. International markets are hazardous, and many former customers are now in Soviet-dominated areas or in regions so internally disturbed that profitable markets cannot be established. We should also note that other countries with progressive, unfolding economies are reaching a degree of industrialism in which they're able to produce many items which previously they had to purchase abroad. Heavy drains upon personal incomes in terms of taxes and the rising cost of living force discrimination and self-restraint. Of course, this is further complicated by the multiplication of similar goods on our own markets. 50 years ago, we bought a cake of soap when we needed it. We chose from half a dozen brands, most of which had special uses. Today, the array of soaps and detergents is so impressive that we can select a dozen or 20 popular brands with identical purposes. There is simply too much competition in relation to our need for soap. In the frantic scramble for sales promotion, psychological advertising seems to offer a roseate future. It is a snare and an illusion, however, as time will tell, because it is available to all manufacturers, and competition will only be raised to a more abstract level. The consumer is thus gradually becoming the victim of strategy in high places. He has already been overeducated in luxury spending. He is trying to maintain the highest standard of living ever recorded, and he shows distinct signs of suffering from the strain. He is more unhappy and insecure than he was under a less intensive code of existence. If we force him beyond his endurance, he may not rebel physically, but his personal psychology of life will be demoralized. No permanent good can be attained by forcing upon him more than he can endure, regardless of the motivation. To press this point is to meet increasing sales resistance. Psychology is basically a therapeutic art. It is intended to restore normalcy rather than to stimulate abnormalcy. If we abuse its principles, we will ultimately suffer from the results of abuse by encouraging irresponsibility throughout society. The man who drops dead in his office at 50 because of the strain of a competitive business psychosis is not contributing to new markets or wider distribution. Yet executives in industry are forced into such unrealistic situations that they cannot survive. Many of them are required to excel all of their predecessors, or to exceed all previous sales records, or they will be promptly replaced. This pressure is passed on to the distributor and the retailer, and the latter bestows it upon his customers. The automotive industry is the outstanding example of sales pressures completely beyond reason. As the sickness inevitably resulting from such methods spreads through society, it cannot be absorbed, but gradually takes on the proportions of a disease. We cannot cure a situation of this kind by simply letting it take its course, or by attempting to put off the evil day with artificial stimulants. Many an exhausted executive has resorted to alcohol, only to end as an alcoholic with his abilities further impoverished. It may sound platitudinous, but the answer lies in the neglected fields of religion, philosophy, and ethics. We have tried in every possible way to evade the basic issue, but, as always, we have tried in vain. No problem can be solved until man becomes wiser and better than the problem. No institution is so vast or so prosperous that it can escape from the censorship of right principle. In every walk of life, overemphasis upon competitive policies brings tragedy. It is the human being and not his institutions that must receive first consideration. Everything possible should be done to make his life secure and to free him from those material hazards which interfere with his growth and development as a person. The purpose of business is to serve the human need and to make available to man those commodities and services which protect him and promote his welfare. A policy which affirms that man is merely a creature to be preyed upon and to be ruthlessly exploited is not essentially different from a political dictatorship or a religious tyranny. Sciences must be guided by moral directives. Many scientists have made a strong point of their isolation from ethical implications. They tell us frankly that they discover and create, and it is up to other stratas of society to determine the level of ethics to be maintained. Obviously, this is wrong to start with. The scientist himself must accept some responsibility for his own ingenuity. He must take adequate steps to circumscribe his findings with protective mechanisms. It is the duty of leaders in all brackets to see that their followers are as enlightened as possible. The way things are today, however, there are few inducements for this standard of thinking. Opposed to small groups of idealists who are striving to make good use of advanced learning, are powerful organizations with immense opinion-making facilities, but with apparently little intention of being intelligently helpful. Yet a balance must be maintained if the total picture is to become more optimistic. We cannot continuously use knowledge to perpetuate schemes principally selfish. It is not only bad for our own people, but a most disillusioning spectacle for other nations, whose respect we hope to invite and hold. It seems to me that psychological merchandising is going to increase public suspicion and anxiety. Even assuming that it will not be carried to its possible extreme, it will hang like the sword of Damocles over the head of the individual consumer. The public mind is developing many neurotic tendencies, and morbid imaginings must be expected. There is likely to be strong opposition from religious and ethical groups and a strong demand for a revising of the entire advertising program under more rigid supervision. Government intervention may be requested and the whole issue dumped into the field of politics. Several persons who have already seen the announcements tell me that if invisible advertising is introduced on television, they will dispose of their sets. They are also concerned about the effect of such advertising upon their children, particularly as it relates to products not suitable for juvenile consumption. The idea will move into the realm of science fiction, where facts will be hopelessly distorted and anxieties further increased. It will broaden the breach of antagonism against the methods of big business, where feelings are already not too friendly. It is sincerely to be hoped, therefore, that adequate public polls will be taken before the experiment is tried. It may also be noted that the basic idea could, at least theoretically, be applied to other media, until man's psychic life could be subjected to numerous attacks without his knowledge or consent. All this may be exonerated on the level of a completely materialistic point of view in which nothing is especially valuable or important. But if this attitude takes over, we may well be in for serious trouble. We already know that the pressure of externals is causing more conflict than the psychic integration of most persons can withstand. The inevitable hypnosis of things daily seen, of attitudes daily contacted, and policies daily tolerated is contributing heavily to mental illness. Our defense is still our own internal integration. If this is encouraged and strengthened, we can meet outer pressures with some semblance of success. We turn to those convictions which arise in our own nature and hope that our instincts and intuitions will preserve us in time of trouble. We may also attempt to study our own psychic resources and to evaluate our attitudes and emotions. Thus, by degrees, we make consoling discoveries, most of which point in the direction of the protecting power of personal character and traditional convictions which are essentially right and proper. To interfere with our internal lives is a frontal attack against privacy. Even if the suggestion were constructive, the delicate question could be raised: should an individual even be reformed without his consent, or without his recognition of personal need. As physical conditions have gradually escaped from control in this age of atomics and electronics, there has been a notable change in public thinking. The tendency to plan life and to bestow purposeful objectives upon our children has lessened. We think more and more in terms of the moment only, and view the political discords of neighboring powers with grave apprehension. We wonder if we can escape the terrifying implications of atomic warfare and its unpredictable consequences. Gradually, there has been a trend toward a recognition of ethical needs. Scientific institutions have introduced ethical programs in the hope that these will have a civilizing influence upon the tendency of skill to become an obsession. Everything possible should be done to establish some point of security in society or in the individual, which will help to sustain a constructive viewpoint under prevailing conditions. Religion has always taught that man's internal life, with its root in a divine principle, is his greatest protection. If he can accomplish internal serenity of spirit, he is victor in the conflict of life. No one has disproved this point, and there have been innumerable testimonies in its support. If it is a crime to damage the physical estate of a person, it is a sin to attack his inner resources. When the afflicted mortal turns into himself, he should not find his subconscious cluttered with conditioned reflexes about cosmetics, dog food, and alkalizers. These can contribute nothing to moral fabric or spiritual strength. It is vitally important to cleanse this inner life, for it is our only and direct road to those values which we hold most sacred. It is our temple, our sacred place, and it should certainly not be profaned, nor should it become a house of merchandising. The needs of man's soul take precedence over the requirements of his body. The solution to the world problem must first come to and through the human soul. The maturing of this soul, its dedication to external values, and its courageous defense of the good and the true are the hope of humanity. All policies contrary to such convictions are the byproducts of materialism. The materialist seeks to compel us to accept life as a physical phenomenon alone. He would convince us that our inner life is only the distillation of our outward attitudes, and that we have no substance behind the shadow of our personality. This whole indoctrination is terribly and pathetically wrong. We have lived under it for half a century, and already it is practically unendurable. It is not nostalgic to wish for something better or to defend what survives of a better concept. Buying and selling may be the life of trade, but the soul of the trader must also be considered. We have already seen that the things we buy bring no lasting satisfaction. We trade them in and sell them off, perhaps even before we have completed payment. Society cannot endure merely by a philosophy of barter and exchange. Art and literature have already suffered, and even music has not totally escaped. We no longer read good poetry, nor have we leisure for the cultivation of any internal grace. We are glued to television with its endless cycle of superficial entertainment. We are allowing these media, television, motion pictures, and radio to become the principal educators of our moods and emotions. With some notable exceptions, little is actually done to use these tremendous instruments to direct our civilization into constructive channels, or to inspire us to improve our own natures. There is an ancient observation that deformity, long viewed, becomes acceptable. That which at first seems repulsive loses its menacing aspect through frequent repetition. We become accustomed to anything. All we are saying, that habit lowers our guards and destroys or neutralizes our discrimination. In the course of time, when generations that had more substantial foundations have entirely disappeared, we must depend for the future of our world upon individuals who have never known a gentle or peaceful way of life. There seems no good reason why we should hasten our own misfortunes by supporting or even enduring that which is obviously inconsistent with good taste. If the worst happens, we will probably develop defenses. But why should we devote generation after generation of our people to a perpetual struggle against something that should never have been? Why not rather utilize our resources to do those things which are worth doing? To summarize our thinking, then, let us restrain our foolishness to that level upon which we can at least cope with it and occasionally achieve a victory. Let us keep advertising agencies in those comfortable offices where they now function, and out of our subconscious minds. Let them sell their wares as artistically and dramatically as they please, but let us reserve to ourselves the conscious right to decide what we want and when we want it. The subconscious mind is private property. It is also the source of many advantageous discoveries. It contributes to originality and can lead to the final solution of numerous uncertainties. Strengthened and educated, disciplined and properly directed, it can enrich the whole world by producing persons with individual initiative and creative courage. Let us not tamper with it. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.